right. I'm Stephen Minot Tomczak, president of the Social Welfare History Group, and on behalf of our planning committee, welcome to our webinar on Red Scares. This will cover elements of our recently released bibliography on the subject, which you will hear more about. The Social Welfare History Group began notably in the shadow of McCarthyism and in a period of ferment in social work education. The immediate precipitating event that led to its founding was a session on social values and social action, the intellectual base as illustrated in the study of history, at the January 1956 annual program meeting of the Council on Social Work Education. This was given by noted social work educator Carl DeShinitz, and is the first newsletter of the group issued in December of 1956 reported. This led to a suggestion that some method be found to maintain continued education on this subject. The suggestion took the form of what was originally called the Committee on the History of Social Welfare, an organization that changed its name to the Social Welfare History Group in 1962. Newsletters have been published since that time, and concurrently, the group has issued bibliographies of scholarship on social welfare history. As indicated, the emergence of this group following the McCarthyite attacks on social reform, and in a decade generally hostile to social welfare, this reflected what Fisher called a turn away from the 1950s and toward areas less constrained by conservative models and politics. Today, we see a political economic context that, while not identical to that of the 1950s, does show parallels with this earlier period, as our webinar today will elaborate. This turn to extreme right-wing reaction, exemplified by Trumpism, has again promoted renewed interest in history. Critiques of the white supremacy embedded in the field of social work and its educational establishment are again promoting examination of social work's curriculum with an eye towards history. And this context has again provided both impetus and opportunity for those of us, like Carl DeShinitz and his generation of scholars, want to promote the role of historical teaching and scholarship in this field. To this end, we have recently reinstituted bibliographies on scholarship and social welfare history with a new twist, which is a topical focus, including the bibliography on Red Scares, which inspired this webinar. And so it is critically important that we study this history to inform current activism. Both by learning the lessons of the past, we can get ideas of what we might do, but also things we might avoid. Next slide, please. Another initiative that we've recently established, in addition to the bibliographies, is a doctoral student group that brings together emerging scholars interested in studying social welfare history in their dissertation projects. We're planning a series of events which will be announced as we go forward. And as you can see from the slide, you can join our Google group at the link indicated, also our listserv. We are distributing a survey which you can access by scanning that QR code, which will also allow you to join. And you see Justin Hardy's email on the slide as a contact. Next slide, please. Another very important thing that the group wishes to highlight today is a fundraiser that we are engaging in. And this is related to our topic today. We're attempting to raise money to digitize important sources for the study of social welfare history. The journal Social Work Today, which you see on the slide here, was published by leaders of the rank and file movement, which in the 1930s sought to move social work in a more radical, labor-oriented direction. The journal was published from 1935 until 1942 and is a fabulous resource for recapturing this lost history of radical activism in social work. but it has not been made available digitally. And so, today, the Social Welfare History Group is seeking support from attendees. And you see here the QR code and the link to donate, which will allow you to contribute to this important effort. You see, we have currently $645 raised. We're trying to get to $1,200. So please donate to this important fundraising effort. Next slide, please. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. I would like to go over the agenda. You see this on your slide. Maybe Abramovitz will be leading off with an overview of this history, followed by Jessica Toft reviewing the first Red Scare, Kit Ginzky looking at the Great Depression, Jane McPherson focusing on McCarthyism. And each speaker will introduce themselves as they go along. Closing remarks will be offered by Laura Curran. Please, if you can, put your questions into the Q&A in the bottom. Justin Hardy will be fielding the questions at the end. And finally, one more thing, please join the Social Welfare History Group email list. You can email me, we'll add you to our email list. And so with all of that, let me turn things over to Mimi Abramovitz to provide some background on Red Scares.
Mimi, be sure to unmute.
Me unmute. Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Zach. And welcome to all to this very important webinar. I'm going to start with the definition. What is a Red Scare? Because some people may not have even heard the term. So Red Scares describe the times in U.S. history when a group or the government itself seeking to uphold the class, race, and gendered status quo publicly identifies and undermines their political opponents, typically without much evidence. Sound familiar? By calling them communists, socialists, anarchists, more recently terrorists, and now woke, and accusing them of disloyalty to the United States. The term Red Scare comes from the historic connection of the color red with communism. Next slide. When and why did Red Scares occur? This is going to be a brief overview, and the other panelists will go into greater depth. The first Red Scare, 1919 to 29, was sparked by the 1917 Russian Revolution. Some in the US feared the revolutionary spirit or communism would take hold in the US. Leaders in business and government who wanted to preserve the status quo targeted all dissent as communism, with an especially hard focus on labor and immigrants. Many of the latter were deported or jailed. The Depression and the New Deal. During this time, ideas of communism and socialism gained popularity in the United States. The economic hardship of the times, plus the demands of militant trade unions, civil rights, feminist, and consumer movements, actively challenged the status quo. Among other things, their demands for higher taxes and a robust welfare state, and their call to redistribute income downward from the wealthy to the working class, led the powers to be fear that the Russian Revolution was on their doorstep. The result, an anti-communism backlash that laid the groundwork for the Second Red Scare. Also referred to as McCarthyism, the Second Red Scare emerged after World War II. If the successful 1917 Russian Revolution sparked the first one, the successful 1949 Chinese Communist Revolution sparked the Second Red Scare. It was fueled as well by a post-war strike wave with workers in major US industries demanding higher wages, safer working conditions, union recognition. Less well-known middle-class housewives organized the consumer movement, calling for lower prices and higher quality products. Working-class women joined and resisted efforts to return Rosita River to the home. The mass protests in favor of more government, better working conditions, and justice for marginalized populations literally rocked the nation. Seeking to stop this challenge by any means possible, the political and corporate elite revived the specter of communism, to undermine the social movement's demands for a real welfare state and to justify the ensuing political repression and imprisonment of the critics. Sparing no exaggeration, Senator Joseph McCarthy and FBI Director Hoover, among many others, described the welfare state as, quote, creeping socialism, and attacked labor leaders, civil rights activists, government workers, teachers, social workers, and Hollywood artists, and many others as, quote, fellow travelers. They suggested that, quote, Reds were about to take over the US. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the following key federal agencies and congressional committees were charged with managing the repression, and each sensationalized the Red Scare. You'll hear more about them. The FBI, the Special Committee to Investigate Un-American Activities, followed by the House Un-American Activities, and the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. The second Red Scare also fueled the Cold War with Russia. Next slide, please. As you can see from these slides, in each Red Scare, powerful interests in governments mobilized unfounded fears of an internal communist enemy. In each Red Scare, using the same tools of intimidation, political and corporate elite accused individuals and organizations that challenge the status, the social, economic, gendered, and racialized status quo. In each Red Scare, fears of charges of subversion spread through American politics, culture, and wider society to silence dissent and effectively narrow the overall social and political discourse. The accused support for social change, a larger role for government, and justice for marginalized groups had to be stopped. So thousands of ordinary people lost their jobs and their families, marriages, friends, and other important personal relationships. Some often suffered organized violence, deportation, or prison. The climate of fear, suspicion, surveillance, and curtailed rights effectively stamped out many, but not all, progressive individuals and political organizations, or pushed them underground. Now, it's really important for us today to recognize that the Red Scare did not skip individual social workers or the profession. Many people are not aware of this. However, social work emerged during the first Red Scare that targeted many well-known and less well-known social workers. The post-World War II Red Scare surfaced during social work's impressionable adolescence, seeking to secure its identity, which we all know about that period, its status and its place among the professions, if not wider society. Social work fell victim to the Red Scare's fear-mongering. With some important exceptions, many social workers intentionally self-centered, censored. They didn't speak, also known as the chilling effect. They tolerated attacks on their colleagues, if not naming names, snitching on others, one would say. Social work education and professional organizations in turn marginalized macro social work, history, and in general constrained their agenda to conform to prevailing pressures. This narrowed focus of social work education, if not the entire profession, remains with us today, and many groups are still fighting to broaden that agenda. As Zach mentioned, the Social Welfare History Group emerged during this period, seeking to preserve, I should say, and correct the historical record. Next slide. Our bib and webinar also raises the specter of a modern version of the Red Scare that is fueling the rise of authoritarianism. In How Democracies Die, two political scientists identify 4 warning signs of democracies in trouble. They include rejecting democratic norms or the rules of the game, denying the legitimacy of political opponents, curtailing opponents' civil liberties, and tolerating or encouraging violence. I'm sad and sorry to say that nearly all the signs are evident in the US today. The authors concluded that democracy does not necessarily end with a bang, a violent military revolution, or by a coup. Rather, and this is the scary part, it ends with a whimper, the slow, steady weakening of critical institutions. Think about the vote, elections, the press, the courts, the media. And Tom Eddsdale detailed and warned us of this very process in today's New York Times. These warning signs should give us pause. During the first 2 Red Scares, unfounded charges of communism took a heavy toll. More recently, an updated version of the Red Scare stoked fears of terrorism and rounded up immigrants in particular. They also attacked the Squad, 4 women of color elected to the US House, as communists or socialists and questioned their citizenship status. Today's fear of wokeness justified banning books, curtailing public education, denying historical truths, and otherwise repressing critics and critiques of white supremacy and patriarchy. All you have to do is think of Florida, but Florida is not alone. Still others sowed a distrust of the nation's democratic institutions, creating receptivity for authoritarianism, voter suppression, election subversion, gerrymandering. Changing these structures disenfranchised voters around the country. Charges of fake news discredit the press, the belief in a deep state, the repeated calls to stop the steal, and the violent January 6th attack in the US Capitol mobilized distrust of the states. The loss of voting rights, think Texas and Georgia and many other states. Reproductive freedom, think Dodd and the current follow-up. And gun safety, think Nashville, Tennessee, paves the way for the Supreme Court, I'm sorry to say, to dismantle affirmative action, same-sex marriage, disability, and other constitutional rights. These recent efforts to sow distrust of the nation's democratic institutions go beyond enforcing the status quo. They follow the well-known, well-documented authoritarian playbook. Taken together, and I'll be winding up in a second, the history of American Red Scares points to an evolving political landscape with distinct patterns. It's not just isolated bouts of anti-communist hysteria that explode onto the scene and then vanish. No, under the disguise of protecting democracy by limiting these so-called threats to the American way of life, the Red Scares instead undermined democracy, stifled progressive social policy, and infringed on constitutional rights to freedom of speech, expression, and association. The new Red Scare bibliography suggests that Red Scares may be part of the societal DNA and that we had not seen the last one. Next slide. And last one. Why now? The Social Welfare History Group believes that history informs the present, as Zach said earlier, and the future. With this bibliography, we ask if the current charges carried out in the name of national security, election integrity, wokeness, and restoration of the American way of life qualify as a modern-day Red Scare. We hope the following more detailed historical review of U.S. Red Scares will help social workers grapple with this question and fight back. If the past becomes prologue, if we ignore temporary threats to democracy, and we ignore these threats at our own risk. It is also the case that tolerating state actions that violate professional or humane standards bolster society's conservative forces and risk alignment with them. Thank you. And now Jessica will go into more detail about the first Red Scare.
Thank you so much, Mimi. I appreciate it. I'm Jessica Toft with the University of Minnesota and the Vice President of the Social Welfare History Group. And I'll start off with the first Red Scare to give us some context. So during the Industrial Revolution, the United States experienced 7 panics, recessions, and depressions, many lasting several years. Extreme poverty, deadly factory accidents, child labor, disease, hunger, and homelessness were common amid Gilded Age laissez-faire capitalism. In response, labor union membership grew 8-fold from 1900 to over 4 million by 1919. The progressive era reformers battled poor social conditions of urban industrialism. Settlements, populist politics, and movements of women, Blacks, club women, muckraking, and activist journalists successfully fought for assistance to support parenting, child welfare, public health, and other cultural and social services. Workers won significant concessions from corporations, including improved wages and working conditions. In April of 1917, the US entered World War I. 6 months later, the Russian Bolshevist Revolution led to the first socialist government worldwide, instilling fear among capitalist leaders. In the US, workforce and welfare state gains of the Progressive era threatened the prevailing social order that protected and promoted the interests of capitalists and those who had fared best under the system: whites, men, Christians, US-born citizens, and corporations. To quell this progress, the government and big business joined forces. The US government drew on both new and longstanding federal laws such as the Enemy Alien Act of 1800, the Immigrant and Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903, and the more recent Espionage Act and State Criminal Syndicalism Statutes of 1917. The US Army established the Military Intelligence Division, and the Department of Justice advanced its Bureau of Intelligence Reconnaissance. Legislators, high-level bureaucrats, and the military cooperated to suppress government critiques, surveil the public, censor telecommunications, mail-in media, and deport immigrants, often by executive order. The courts permitted arrests of immigrants suspected of Bolshevist leanings and without warrants, and held preliminary hearings without counsel. Big business and the pro-war government used anti-union propaganda to destabilize the mounting trade union movement, which they argued would lead to revolution in the US. They especially feared the radical but powerful industrial workers of the world, whose call for one giant union of unskilled workers encompassing all races, sexes, immigrants, and migrants challenged the power of big business. Emboldened by the public's acceptance of an anti-labor narrative, businesses deployed private police forces to break up strikes with violence. And working with government, they were also able to deploy local police, state militias, and the National Guard to quash strikes and silence most other forms of dissent. Wilson's call to war in 1917 also rallied vigilance groups, a local control tool used to maintain social order since colonial times. According to Capozzola, the citizen policing, anti-labor, moral, and racial vigilance groups targeted pacifists, suffragists, ethnic minorities, religious fundamentalists, trade unionists, and socialists. Acting as a pseudo-arm of the government, they quelled labor strikes and pacific protests, ravaged community of colors, and silenced dissenting political views. Wilson and his cabinet also formed the Committee on Public Information in 1917 to craft military propaganda. Media, government, and military leaders collaborated to galvanize the nationalist message to argue that the US needed to fight a war abroad to protect democracy at home. The president also warned of a domestic war of sorts. Immigrants were portrayed as enemy aliens and hyphenated Americans. Vigilance groups helped to spread this military propaganda nationwide. Political dissent was considered unpatriotic, ostensibly formed to identify spies. In practice, vigilance groups like the 85,000 member National Security League also operated to keep people generally in line with social norms. Next slide. Following World War I, the government targeted settlements and social workers as part of a larger suspected network of Bolshevist supporters. New York was the hub of this activity. The New York legislature established the New York Joint Legislative Committee to investigate seditious activities known as the Lusk Committee, led by Senator Clayton R. Lusk. It was given substantial power. For more than a year, the committee gathered an enormous body of information on suspected radical groups by raiding organization offices and examining documents, infiltrating meetings, assisting law enforcement agents and the arrests of thousands, and subpoenaing witnesses for the committee's hearings. Among the organizations raided were the Russian Soviet Bureau, the Rand School of Social Science, the left-wing section of the Socialist Party and the Industrial Workers of the World, and 73 branches of the Communist Party. Using search warrants in the raids, the committee seized thousands of documents, financial records, membership lists, and shared them with local district attorneys. Committee investigators observed mass meetings held by suspected radical groups and reported to the committee on the makeup of audiences and the content of speeches. Settlement houses soon became a target. The New York Times followed the Lusk Committee's work and investigations of the Lusk Committee, typically sympathetically, and the Lusk Committee introduced a bill to the New York legislature that would require all private schools, courses, and classes, except those of religious schools, to apply for licenses to the Board of Regents of the University of the State of New York. This measure was to censor what could be taught at all levels of schools, and social work classrooms were especially of interest. In the proposal, faculty and public schools were required to sign loyalty oaths. In response, social workers and social reformers resisted seditious and negative portrayals by writing editorials and journal articles, making speeches, and engaging legal counsel. The Survey, a progressive journal edited by Paul Kellogg, lent its pages to editorials critiquing the constraint of free speech and democratic deliberation and the muzzling of social work educators. Mary Simkovich, the director of Greenwich House, deftly handled questions in a New York Times interview regarding settlement houses. She denied that the seditious ideas were taught, but did maintain that radical ideas were allowed to be discussed, that issues that affected neighbors' daily lives, such as unaffordable rent and daily living expenses, should be aired and discussed with reason and wisdom and should be addressed through legal and orderly processes. Alluding to the Constitution, she remarked that settlements offered a place for free assemblage and free speech, freedom and equal opportunity. She pivoted to the role settlements played during the war, and I quote her, "During the war, the settlements were used as a headquarters for every government agency, the Liberty Loan, Food Administration, Fuel Administration, Red Cross, War Risk Insurance, Children's Year, etc., reminding readers and politicians of settlements' vital role during the war for their constituents." She ends with statements that implicitly counter the ideology of the Lust Committee. She says, "Our national life must be progressive, liberal, and based on the development throughout the entire country of the permeating spirit of cooperation, or else we face the alternative of untempered hostilities. America is a kindly nation. Have we the brains and the purpose to effect a real democracy and yet avoid the tyranny of class government? The purpose of the community house is to develop cooperation in every aspect of our life, industrial, social, cultural, and political." Yet in important ways, settlement houses cooperated with the anti-immigrant campaign by Americanizing new immigrants. Their English language and citizenship classes and discussion clubs often sought to assimilate new immigrants to subscribe to the country's white, educated, middle-class expectations. And just before World War I, and much more intentionally, Francis Keller, Hull House alum and leader of the Americanization movement, wrote Straight America, meaning One America, a book that was read by many leaders. And in it, she openly stated, "We do not all speak the same language nor follow the same flag. America has neglected, even forgotten, its task of making Americans of the people who have come to its shores. But the final question for this nation to answer is, are they loyal American citizens?" End quote. And while Keller later disavowed harsh tactics, such narratives legitimize state and citizen group scrutiny of immigrants and persons perceived as countering American norms. After the dissolution of the Lust Committee in 1921, the state and vigilance groups continued to fan suspicion through propaganda. For example, in 1923, a military librarian drafted the infamous spiderweb chart, which you see in the middle of the slide. The single-page document diagrammed supposed links among many civil society associations, especially those involving highly active women's social reform organizations, and many of them included famous social workers. It labeled their leaders as radical, unfeminine, and un-American. And the list includes social work leaders and participant in 37 such women's groups, including the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, National Consumers League, Women's Trade Union League, National Congress of Mothers, League of Women Voters, Women Christian Temperance Union, National American Women's Suffrage Association, Young Women's Christian Association, and more. The spiderweb chart both identified communist domestic enemies and silenced challenges to the ideas that upheld the dominant social order. Nick Fisher, who wrote a book on the subject in 2016, asserts, and I quote, "Built on slanderous assertions, gross simplifications, stereotypes, and paranoid fantasies, this political propaganda gave anti-communists a raison d'etre. It's very succinct and readily understandable. The chart refused almost any need for justification and explanation. A lesson in the power of brevity and naming names was learned." Next slide. By the end of the first Red Scare, an extensive playbook for political repression existed. It included the coordination of anti-communist drives by the state, businesses, and military and police. And this included the application of outdated and colonial-based laws to current domestic arenas, the collusion of courts to deport immigrants, the deployment of police forces to ensure individuals and groups were abiding by new laws and policies. It significantly led to the creation and installment of government surveillance and censorship capabilities that was used to limit opposing political views. while Alice Smith vetoed the bill to require licensing of social science subjects and requirement of teacher and faculty loyalty oaths, the ideas were launched. The partnership of the state with local vigilance groups to ensure social order across wide expanses of geography was another development. The honing of effective propaganda to shape public discourse, especially by crafting persuasive briefs that named names, was another lesson. Finally, the persecution by state and local officials of outgroups involving raids, investigations, and public hearings lent a sense of personal threat to taking unpopular political positions. The events of the first Red Scare left a well-developed blueprint readily used by leaders of future Red Scares for their own communist campaigns. So now we are going to hear from Kit from the University of Chicago. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kit Ginzky, and I'm a PhD student in history and social work at the University of Chicago. And I'm going to follow up on Jessica's excellent presentation about the first Red Scare by asking, where did anti-communism and repression go in the period between the first Red Scare and the McCarthyism that we primarily associate with the 1950s? And also, how does this connect to social welfare policy and advocacy in this period? So I'd like to start picking up where Jessica left off in the mid to late 1920s. Because within the social work community, I think we often have this idea of the 1920s as a time when social workers primarily turned away from reform and toward individual treatment, as they focused on professionalization and increasing their own occupational status as their primary goal. And we also often hear that the US didn't have a welfare state until the New Deal, which, as Jessica just reviewed, is not actually entirely the case. In fact, prior to the New Deal, there was a lot of experimental work happening, especially at the state and local level, in expanding the state's responsibility for things like public health, welfare, and the protection of workers. And in 1921, following the advocacy and leadership of many social workers, Congress passed the Shepard-Towner Act, which vastly expanded resources for maternal and child health, and instituted a large number of public maternal health centers and funding for social workers and midwives, especially in the South. And you can see in the top left corner of the slide an image from the National Children's Year, which was sponsored by the Children's Bureau, a federal agency in many ways founded by and administered by social workers. And so given this, I think when we look to this period, it's very helpful to ask, what were social workers doing in the reform sphere just prior to the New Deal? And what was politically possible at the time? And we can start to think about how the context of the Red Scare that they had just emerged from cast a long shadow over what was seen as politically viable or possible to advocate for in this period. And moving into the 30s, which we think of as a high point for left-wing political activity, including organizing by militant labor unions and the Communist Party, which was very active in this period in our country, we start to see the context of anti-communism emerging more clearly. I think that oftentimes in discussions of Red Scares and the history of anti-communism, this is a period that tends to be overlooked because of the popularity that was enjoyed by left-wing ideas, political groups, and organizers in this period. And it's not necessarily a time that we think repression and anti-communism were important political forces. And in a certain sense, that's true, because in response to political pressure from the left, the federal government took unprecedented responsibility in the New Deal for public welfare, as Congress and President Roosevelt created a host of new agencies, including FERA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the WPA, as well as we all know, the Social Security legislation, protection for labor, public health, and the massive expansion of infrastructure. But I suggest that we see this very much as a response to political pressure from the left. We see an unemployed council in that large image on the bottom. And in that context, we can begin to see the persistence and endurance of the anti-communism from an earlier moment through this period between the two major scares. And in fact, we can find evidence that even at this high point, efforts to expand the state's responsibility for public welfare were continuously demonized and labeled as socialist, communist, or as attempts to overthrow so-called American values of rugged individualism and the sort of mythic American laissez-faire capitalism that we've all heard so much about. So we can move to the next slide. So this slide gives us an opportunity to think about how the tactics of anti-communism and Red Scares endured during this period. So first, going back to the 20s, when the Shepard-Towner Act was up for renewal in 1927, it faced widespread accusations from its political opponents as being communist or socialist or un-American. And I have a quote here from a Senator King of Utah, who said that basically the legislation was championed by neurotic women, social workers who obtained pathological satisfaction in interfering with the affairs of other people, and Bolsheviks who did not care for the family and its perpetuity. So even though this is legislation that was helping preserve maternal and child health and trying to sort of support family life and reproduction, it was labeled anti-family and communist. And with the sort of neurotic label, we might even start to think about how anti-communism relates to anti-Semitism, which then we'll see very clearly in this next example, which is from 10 years later in 1937, recalling the important role played by militant labor unions in advocating for the New Deal. We see that they began to be attacked frequently as being communist, controlled by Moscow. And so in the middle of the slide here, we have an example of a sticker from 1937 that was circulated by a white nationalist organization calling the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, a major body of militant labor unions, Jew communist chieftains directed from Moscow. And it has the names of various labor organizers. It has the coat of arms of the CIO, which is in fact a hammer and sickle. And smears like this were very common, which raises a question that's important in this period. The Communist Party and communist leaders were in fact active participants in left-wing movements during this period, which we also was also called the Popular Front period, going into the 40s. But in this moment, there were around 3 million active union members and around 66,000 active Communist Party USA members. So even though some of these leaders were actually in the Communist Party, it doesn't track that they were controlled by the Communist Party. They certainly weren't controlled by Moscow, and it just raises a lot of questions that I think we need to continue pondering about the relationship between political activity, and between politics and anti-communism and smears. And so then moving to the right of the slide, we have the response from the CIO. This is a pamphlet from 1938, where a group from a CIO local wrote, "Is the CIO communistic?" And they go on to say, "The CIO does not have offices in Moscow, Russia. It has them in Washington, D.C., USA. We are not trying to overthrow capitalism, but we support the New Deal government and want workers to be protected from being exploited by big business and huge corporations." They go on to say that they support the Constitution, that they draw inspiration from American figures like Abraham Lincoln, and oh, by the way, FDR has also been labeled a communist frequently in this period, and he was reelected in a landslide. So they note that anti-communism is a losing argument in this time period, and basically these are false allegations. But the fact that they even had to produce such a document responding to these claims shows us something that I think is important about the persistence of these allegations, which were both still around and impeding the work of organizers, even in the 1930s, which is considered the highest point of these ideas. And that raises questions about the relationship between the realm of politics and what happens in civil society and public discourse and the state itself. Because in the lead up to World War II and throughout the war, the organizations that Jessica described ramped up their anti-communist surveillance apparatus, which paved the way for the repression of the McCarthy period rather directly. The FBI in particular increased its surveillance of organizations and individuals that they suspected were fascist or communist. And this surveillance was then used to justify the formation of Congress's Special Committee on Un-American Activities, which is called the Guise Committee. And it used surveillance to bring people in to testify if they thought that they were quote unquote Reds or involved in communist Moscow controlled organizations. And it's when the practice of naming names was first established. And that's a repressive practice that then becomes a major hallmark of McCarthyism in the following period. So moving on to the next slide. Within social work, this period brought us to a crossroads. In an era of high unemployment, of labor militancy, of left-wing political action and new demands being made of the state, many people began to ask how social workers should relate to the rise of the welfare state, the working class, and the labor movement. It's also a continuation of that classic question of, so should social work be profession-oriented, or are we trying to work ourselves out of a job? And what does that mean politically? And so on one hand, social work's professional leaders, many of them emphasized the importance of working with the Roosevelt administration to pass reforms rather than joining these protests on the outside and becoming involved in grassroots advocacy. And social workers like Harry Hopkins, Frances Perkins, Grace Abbott, and Paul Kellogg used their positions in the New Deal administration to oversee the creation of many new jobs for social workers, which they envisioned would help form the basis of a stable professional future for trained professional social workers. However, there were so many jobs created that many of them went to quote unquote untrained social workers who found themselves in these new positions, but identified much more with their unemployed clients than with the goals of reproducing the profession itself. And so in the late 1930s, more than 12,000 social workers participated in the rank and file movement, which urged social workers to organize their own trade unions and fight to improve their working conditions and wages, as well as to agitate for better social conditions more broadly, including anti-racist and civil rights causes, as well as the expansion of government welfare. So for example, at the bottom on the right, we see a statement from the rank and file movement in 1936, where they were directly confronting the National Association of Social Workers, who held a convention at a hotel where the bar was in fact segregated. And they confronted that choice, saying that the social workers should never patronize businesses and should never hold conferences in places where Black and white social workers could not convene together. So in addition to challenging sort of the larger power structure and the government, these social workers challenged social work and its professional bodies. And many of them coordinated through what they called social work discussion clubs, which we see the letterhead from their coordinating committee. And they also had an incredible journal, Social Work Today, which you've already heard, we're raising funds to digitize. And this would be a very important resource for teaching about this history and studying it in the future. And they used these publications to circulate their ideas, to organize across cities, and also plan for political action. But many members of social work's professional leadership saw the strength of this movement and were threatened by it and saw their goals being shaken by the huge number of people who were involved in trying to push social work in a different direction. And so, unsurprisingly, political opponents began to claim that this movement was controlled by the Communist Party, signaling once again the form of attacks that would intensify and only formalize more in the McCarthy era. In a 1935 article published in Social Work Today, a social worker at the Kansas City Men's Bureau named DeWitt Gilpin wrote about his dismissal from that job, claiming that rank and file members, quote, were accused of being disloyal to the agency, of being Reds, and being disgruntled and inefficient workers, end quote. And so this raises the question once again, were they Reds, and does it matter? Jacob Fisher, the editor of Social Work Today, who had been an active Communist Party member, acknowledged that the party did play a significant role in the movement. He said years later, quote, many of us were members or closely associated with its organizations. We read the Daily Worker and were keenly interested in what they had to say. The editorial positions of Social Work Today could certainly be said to sometimes mirror the party lines, but to say that we were dominated by the party would simply be incorrect. We were as a whole an independent movement and journal, often agreeing with the party, but also interested in bread and butter issues, end quote. So I think that as we look at this period, one of the most important lessons that we can draw is that on one hand, there were many, many committed left-wing, even communist or socialist activists or fellow travelers trying to push social work and politics more broadly toward an expanded welfare state, greater rights and protections for working people, and protection from exploitation in different forms. But at the same time, they and the movements that they were part of were continuously smeared, demonized, and surveilled based on these political commitments. And this both hindered their organizing at the time and then subsequently paved the way for real instances of very serious repression by the state, which took place in more open periods that we would call a Red Scare. And so looking at how there's sort of like this long history of anti-communism is, I think, important in charting our way through the history of repression, not just in the past, but projecting forward into the present and the future. So now we'll hear about McCarthyism from Jane McPherson.
All. I'm really delighted that you're all here, and I'm pleased to be here. And I thank my colleagues. I am not an author on this bibliography, so I respect everyone, and I'm grateful for being able to present their work today. Omissions, of course, are mine. But I will start with, where we are now. You've heard some wonderful kind of, how we got here. Thank you, Kit. We've learned that anti-communism was a losing argument, but not during the period of McCarthyism. From the late 1940s through the late 1950s, sometimes beyond, fear of communism really permeated American politics, culture, and society. And Cold War fears had a freezing effect on progressive and radical politics and action, including in social work. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, had been created in 1938 to investigate alleged disloyalty among private citizens, public employees, and organizations suspected of having communist ties. And it went into overdrive under the leadership of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who served as a Republican senator from Wisconsin from 1947 until his death in 1957. And he made himself famous and gave the era its name by, asserting that large numbers of communists had infiltrated the US State Department and that we had to root them out. He and his allies across the country undermined political, social, and cultural opponents by questioning their loyalty to the US. During this period, many organizations, public, private, and educational, began requiring employees to sign loyalty oaths. The image on the left here is an ironic or joking reference to HUAC's infamous question of, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So evoking the specter of communism and exploiting the fear it provoked destroyed careers, personal and professional relationships, curtailed reform, trampled on basic civil rights, certainly speech, assembly, and privacy. Turning the page. So two non-social work examples that I think provide a real window on the level of fear that was felt by ordinary people, were that libraries, many libraries removed the adventures of Robin Hood from their shelves because the book advocated robbing from the rich to give to the poor. So beware if you have that at home. And the Cincinnati Reds felt the need to change their name to the Redlegs during that period. Very importantly for social work, New Deal programs were discredited as communism or socialism, a move that obviously strengthened the political opponents of the welfare state. American labor, you were just hearing about the CIO, was purged of its most radical members, including unions that represented social workers, a process that destroyed much of its militarism, or rather, sorry, militancy, not militarism, and political independence. And also because the Communist Party supported equal rights for all, those of us who might also support equal rights for all were easily labeled as communists. Leading labor, civil rights, feminists, and professional organizations distanced themselves and purged anyone thought to be a communist. Next slide, please. This is the social work impact. And I thought you'd all be particularly interested in the experiences of individual social workers during this time. The Red Scare engulfed both public and private sector social workers. Throughout the 50s and 60s, the FBI called social workers, especially those advocating economic security, peace, internationalism, human rights, again, things we may all feel quite allied to before congressional committees, subjecting them to loyalty oaths and charging them as security risks, hounding their families, friends, and neighbors, colleagues. Vern Weed, she was attacked by HUAC. She had been a Marxist member of Rank and File. She'd lost her social work job at that time, but was attacked again now for signing the Stockholm Peace Appeal. She did not back down and wrote in 1985, "When McCarthy attacked me for signing the peace appeal, I refused to go on the defensive and reaffirmed my opposition to the A-bomb." And she later taught at Hunter. Sherman Kabovitz was a group worker and Communist Party organizer. He spent a month in solitary confinement for his views. And then later worked as a professor at Richard Stockton College in New Jersey. You may sense a theme. Bertha Caton Reynolds, the visionary social worker who was asked to leave her position at Smith in 1938, was barred from presenting a paper, McCarthyism versus Social Work, at a university seminar for which the paper had been accepted before the title of the talk was announced. Social workers in the academy also came under scrutiny and were silenced or targeted. According to Andrews and Reich, by the 1950s, US universities had become more dependent on government funding, which made them particularly susceptible to this kind of government intervention. Universities with social work programs collaborated with HUAC and FBI investigators and usually succumbed to government pressure. According to Ellen Schrecker in No Ivory Tower, 1986, it was common for faculty members who failed to cooperate to lose their jobs, even if they had tenure at the time. The academy did not fight McCarthyism, she writes. It contributed to it. The dismissals, the blacklists, and above all, the universal acceptance of legitimacy conferred respectability upon the most repressive elements of anti-communist crusade and destroyed the careers of an entire generation of radical intellectuals. And here are a few examples of social work academics whose work was interrupted. The FBI investigated 2 junior faculty members at UConn, Robert Glass and Harold Lewis. Both men were fired despite praise and support from the social work dean and faculty. There was a committee of 5 appointed by UConn who determined that the men were communists. But both men went on to successful academic careers elsewhere. In the late 1940s, Marion Hathaway, who'd been a member of the social work faculty at Pitt since 1932 and was a real leader of the profession at the time, she came under attack. She was criticized locally for sponsoring the Cultural and Scientific Conference for World Peace, at which it was alleged by the local press that Russian communists and their sympathizers were invited to denounce the United States. And also, one of her local judges asserted that she was teaching young folks that there is something wrong with this country, and he demanded that the state of Pennsylvania cut off all funding to the University of Pittsburgh if she was not discharged. In the end, no charges were substantiated or legal action taken. She had great support from her community, but still, she resigned in 1951 and taught at Bryn Mawr until her death in 1955. HUAC also investigated Annabelle Lindsay, pictured here, as a suspected communist. She was an activist and advocate for racial justice and the founding dean of Howard School of Social Work. Finally, and certainly not finally, but finally on my list, Berkeley dismissed Eric Erickson and 35 other social work faculty who refused to sign a loyalty oath. So this gives you a flavor of what was happening in the academy then. Next slide, final, please. So the tactics are clear and frightening, and I think they've been laid out beautifully by my colleagues. So I'm really just going to move on to the effects of social work, on which really, I think this is a place where we should dwell and fear and kind of redouble our own efforts in the present time. The effects of social work at that time are that social work retreated from its New Deal reformist orientation. It narrowed its goals, silenced dissent, limited the content of social work education and journals to non-controversial issues, and diluted its support for social change, social justice, and economic equality. Andrews and Reich write, the social work profession retreated from social action in support of the poor to pursue such mainstream goals as enhanced professional status. Group work and community work were marginalized. This is a really important point because at this period, group work was transformed. Group work, which had really focused on participatory democracy, was narrowed towards therapeutic aid, as I think many of us think of it now. But prior to that, Lewis, one of our fired guys from UConn, he called it the most democratic method in our profession. He also wrote that a huge effect in the period was that we turned ourselves inward for self-preservation. Finally, Andrews and Reich, they say, McCarthyism diminished the gains of the 1930s and 40s, reduced our engagement with the war on poverty in the 60s, and left the profession poorly equipped for the political and social changes of the 60s and 70s. So of lessons I pull from this, as Andrews and Reich write, the story of McCarthyism must be told to remind us that these persecutions could happen again, and that during the Red Scare, the period of intense anxiety, many social workers chose to keep their heads down, and they avoided controversy, survived, as Mimi said, through self-censorship. But though many academic social workers, social work leaders who suffered under HUAC eventually did end up back in university jobs, the profession did not reorient its compass towards anti-poverty work, peace, and group work. Instead, a politically neutral kind of push for professionalization gained and kept the upper hand. These lessons, I think, should help us consider how we want to respond now to bans on the use of critical race theory and discussing race in general, to bans on teaching about gender and sexuality, and our own professional self-censorship and avoidance of dialogue about these issues, as well as anti-colonialism, gun violence, reproductive rights, abortion, etc. So I'll close with these words from Bertha Capon Reynolds from her struck speech called McCarthyism in Social Work. She wrote, when we recover from the fright, which has isolated many of us, enough to get together even in small groups so that we can take counsel about how we can implement our professional principles, we shall have taken an important step towards a mature acceptance of the responsibility and the honor of living in this day. So thanks all. On to Dr. Justin Hardy for Q&A and discussion.
Thank you. One exciting time to be a social worker. So I want to start with a question that I think is kind of connects the past to the present. And that is, what tactics can social workers expect in this current Red Scare? Should we be scared? Can or should we protect ourselves? And how can we protect ourselves? Go ahead, Mimi.
Take a shot at this, because I have been very concerned about, well, first I want to thank my panelists. This is a terrific review and discussion. And I think we all talked about the chilling effect and self-censorship. And the whole discussion around CRT, critical race theory, we've all heard people say that, well, my class was canceled, or by the university, or I decided not to use that book because I'm not tenured and I'm afraid it will happen to me, or I am tenured and I just don't want to get into trouble. I don't want to lose resources and so on. So to me, if it's the first incursion of what we call McCarthyism in our lives, and it is a self-protective move. But self-protection is a double-edged sword. I mean, I totally understand it, and we all need to do it because we need our jobs, and it makes perfect sense. At the same time, we are doing the investigators' work for them. They don't have to knock on our door or speak to our dean about us because we've stopped doing what we want to do and doing what they want. So our silence is consent. The last comment in my introductory comments was, if we tolerate this, we align with the positions that are harming us and our profession. So, and I think Kit talked a lot about the resistance during the 30s. It was a period of greater resistance to all sorts of things that contributed, that led to the Red Scare, because people got afraid of the protesters. But I think that we have to figure out a way to expose what's going on and see the beginning signs of something that will harm us and our profession in the long run. So we have to both protect ourselves and fight back. It's a tricky business, and some people will do some people will do others. But we have to understand that both tracks are really, really necessary.
And if I could just tag on to that, Mimi, thanks so much for that overview. I think this is a tough time. I think also, though, we could take a page from the playbook and really start to own the discourse of democracy. I think democracy was conflated with other kinds of ideas. And if we think about democracy and a welfare state and democracy and the common good and start writing about it and seeding the field with that kind of discourse, it helps us when we start to defend ideas of the welfare state and freedom of speech and those sorts of things. So that's another tactic, I think.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're winding down on time. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A. So I want to just take up two more questions from the attendees. The first one is one from Cassandra that I think is really relevant. And the question is, or as we connect all of these pieces, how much do you see fear of consequences via leadership in schools of social work from university leadership and state legislators serve as obstacles to support and encouragement of what I consider real social justice work, and not just the easy work that is often performative? And how can we change that?
I'm not certain that I know the answer to that at all, but I will say that I think we have to take the risks. And I think that the risks are best borne by those of us with tenure. I think it's very important, even though one of the really important messages from the earlier Red Scare is that that even tenured faculty were fired. I think it is important that we take the risk. And I think it is very clear that, especially those of us who are at public institutions and answerable to legislators and conservative institutions, I think we have to wrap ourselves in our kind of social work ethics and say, I'm not doing this. This is me representing my profession. This is, so how do I show up for social justice? This is something that, I have an LCSW. This is what I do. I have promised to do this. And I think we really have to lean into what our profession requires of us and spend less time being afraid.
Maybe you were going to say something?
Yeah, I'm just trying to recapture my train of thought, but I do think that I'm just going to repeat myself. So if someone else wants to say something, they should just jump in. But we do have to I know what I was going to say. I know my thought. I just captured it. So many times I talk to people about my concerns, my friends on telephone calls, visits, and so on. I say, "What do you think about what's going on?" And we both, we moan and we're very upset and so on. But then people say to me, I can't take it anymore. I can't even listen to the news anymore. And this really scares me, because if you don't know what's happening, you can't understand what's happening, and you can't figure out what you're going to do about it. And I'm sure every one of us here has had that feeling and has heard someone say, I don't read the newspapers much, I don't listen to the news. And I think that's the beginning of the chilling effect. And I think and I understand it, because I get tired and frightened listening to all the things that are going on that I don't like. But I think that first thing is our first task is to make sure we're self-informed, widely informed. And then we figure out what part we can do. You can't take on the whole shebang, but you can do a little bit here and there, and everybody does that. And we begin to join forces and maybe accomplish all the things that Jane just said.
Thank you. I want to, and thank you. Laura messaged me. She's going to cut some time off of her part for some final comments. So I just want to get to maybe one or two quick questions on actual methodology. So Kit, did you want to respond to Michael's question?
Yeah, we had a question in the chat from Michael about the methodology of using surveillance records to bring forward a sort of history from the bottom up, or social history, and some of the challenges of using sources from sort of a repressive state apparatus. And I think this is a really good question, and a lot of great work has been done on how we can read these sources against the grain and essentially take the surveillance records and think against them and with them about what can we see about these people that was sort of not there on the page, and how can we use them to connect to other sources. So one example that I would give is I've taken a look at Berta Capon Reynolds' surveillance FBI file, which is in the Smith College Special Collections, and you can sort of read and see the information that was being kept about her, and the tabs that were being kept on her, and connect that with her speeches, and like with the speech that she wasn't allowed to give, with her diary entries, she wrote these amazing Christmas cards every year where she wrote a poem that spoke to the political conditions of that year. And so I think that archival research and really producing social history involves taking these pieces and thinking critically about them and then connecting them together. And there are lots of amazing historians who have done great work with like police records, with case, even I think we can even think about using case records in this way. Like, how do we locate the person and their resistance and their life in these bureaucratic documents?
Thank you. Laura, did you have a question, or did you want to?
No, I thought I could just say a few things to wrap up from today's session. So I just want to thank all of the presenters again. By the way, I'm Laura. I'm from Rutgers University. I'm one of the advisors to the Social Welfare History Group. I think our big story today is the way in which Red Scares suppress democratic discourse and democratic claims. And they often do this in periods where it's a response, a backlash to advances on equality. I think the other important thing for us to think about is the way in which the complex way in which the state uses both its legislative and administrative executive power in conjunction with corporate and the private sector, as well as civil society, to kind of enact these types of repression. And what's most, I think, one of the most concerning things for us today is really hearing the ways in which this not only affected powerful individuals, but affected everyday individuals. So everyday social workers, everyday teachers ended up having to sign loyalty oaths. Every day, folks were really, this disrupted their lives, it disrupted their livelihoods. And this is particularly true, and we're all probably particularly sensitive to the fact that academia, along with social work and social workers in the field, academic social workers as well, given that the academy is a site of democratic discourse, were particularly and probably, disproportionately affected with these Red Scares. We also saw, finally, the ways in which our profession and academic social work responded to this in mixed ways, right? They were ways in which social workers retreated. There are ways in which folks, there were also claims against the power of the profession that was emerging through the rank and file. So thinking about those various responses is really important to us as we think about ways to respond now. There are historical examples of inspiration. There are also historical examples where we know that the outcomes may have been more problematic for us. And then finally, I know many folks brought up, what can we do? I think the first part of kind of what can we do is to be having a very active discussion about this. And that's very much what this forum is hoping to enable, that we can start talking about this more openly, that we can connect it back to our history, and knowing that there's a history to this actually can make it a bit less scary. We've been through it before. So it's in a way not surprising that we're in another moment, and we do have some a bit of a historical roadmap for us. And then finally, we can also seek in these conversations, whether we're having them in our workplaces, in our academic departments, we should also be having them amongst our professional organizations as well. We do need to bring various groups into this conversation. And I will pass it back over to, one more thing. We are having a follow-up webinar in the fall as well. And there we're actually going to hear from some folks who were targeted by earlier Red Scares. So some earlier social workers are going to share their stories, and we'll also talk more about the contemporary implications. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Kit.
Thank you. And just to close, we wanted to promote our fundraiser again. This is a really important effort for making these sources available will be so useful to both producing new scholarship about how political repression has affected social work in the past, and also to inform our teaching and our conversations about repression in the future. And it looks like now we're at $685. So we've raised $40 during this webinar, which is fantastic. And we're more than halfway to our $1,200 goal. And these are really going to be public, useful shared by all of us. It's all of our history, and it's something that we all will be able to share with our students and with other social workers. So please give if you can. We've all chipped in. And thank you so much for joining us.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance at this webinar. I guess we'll bring it to a close now.